Well, good morning, everyone. On behalf of my colleagues in the UN Working Group and on behalf of the Forum Secretariat, I'd like to warmly welcome you to this, our fourth UN Annual Forum on Business and Human Rights. I think it's fair to say that this is the largest and most diverse gathering on business and human rights in the world. We have over 2,000 participants this year. It's a group ranging from community representatives to company CEOs, and from investors interested in supporting responsible companies to governments interested in regulating them. But as we open this forum and prepare to spend the next 2 days discussing where we are in our field and also where we should be going, we should also acknowledge the people who can't be here. The workers attempting to organize a union in the face of opposition from a company or a country. Farmers trying to access land after their land has been handed over for business operations. And people who don't even know the term human rights defender, let alone the fact that they are one. I want us to keep these people in mind because the theme of this year's forum, tracking progress and ensuring coherence, was designed to make us think at that level, not just in terms of laws and processes, although these things are important, but their ultimate aim is to improve the human rights practices of companies in reality, on the ground, not just on paper and not just in conference rooms. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa. He was the activist who was hanged along with 8 others after campaigning against the destructive impacts of the oil industry in the Niger Delta. Saro-Wiwa's death was one of the formative events in our field, and since that time, we've made significant progress. But we can also still point to many disastrous cases of community impacts from business projects around the world today. Perhaps even more troubling than these individual disasters is the fact that we still don't know whether they have led to improvements in the conditions that gave rise to them. Victims of the Rana Plaza factory collapse, they did receive some compensation and changes in working conditions. But with the data we have now, we cannot say whether safety conditions in the garment sector internationally have improved across the board. That's what the theme of this year's forum is about. Underneath every human rights violation that we hear about are millions more that are invisible to us because their victims are too afraid to report them, or because the local media and civil society is too constrained to take them up. When we hear stories of migrant workers trafficked into forced labor, we often hear at the same time that it was years before the rest of the world found out about them. We're all here at the forum because we want to use the institutional power that we have, whether we're from an NGO or a state or a business or the UN. We want to use that institutional power to find these violations and to also prevent future ones. And we might differ in our approaches, and we might argue about what we should do first or fastest, but we're unified in believing that doing them is deeply important and that it must be a collective effort. So, since tracking progress is part of the theme of our forum this year, I'll say a few words about the progress that we've made. It's been 4 years since our field came together to devise and adopt the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Since then, the Guiding Principles have become the definitive standard for assigning responsibilities to companies and states for preventing human rights abuses and for remedying them. The Guiding Principles have been integrated into international standards, such as the OECD Guidelines on Multinational Enterprises, the IFC Performance Standards, the ISO 26000, and many others. They're supported in declarations and resolutions by all of the regional organizations, by the EU and the Council of Europe, the African Union, ASEAN, the Organization of American States. Earlier this year, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda explicitly cited the guiding principles, with the underlying message that playing a key role in development does not get companies out of their core responsibility to respect human rights. Also this year, the Intergovernmental Working Group carried out the first consultations on the binding instrument on business and human rights, which has the potential to further build on the advancements made by the guiding principles. We've also seen significant action by states. Over 24 governments have already developed or are in the process of developing national action plans on business and human rights. The G7 recently brought increased focus on the drive for responsible supply chains. France, Switzerland, and the EU have all proposed regulation that would make human rights due diligence mandatory for companies. And earlier this year, the China Chamber of Commerce of Metals, Minerals, and Chemicals Importers and Exporters published guidelines on supply chain due diligence. And we're seeing progress among the business community as well. The Economist Intelligence Unit noted earlier this year that companies are increasingly recognizing their responsibility to respect human rights. We're seeing that play out in growing numbers of company policies on human rights and in advanced methodologies on things like human rights impact assessments and grievance mechanisms. Companies are also increasingly reporting on human rights, using tools like the Guiding Principles Reporting Framework and the Global Reporting Initiative. Civil society has also taken up the call, developing initiatives such as the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, the Ranking Digital Rights Index, the Behind the Brands Scorecard. These monitoring efforts help to ensure accountability from the outside. Meanwhile, an increased number of responsible investment vehicles are doing the same from the inside. All of these efforts draw upon the diligent, vital work performed by community advocates, the media, academics, and others, including those working from inside companies, to continue to identify corporate human rights impacts and work toward their prevention and their remedy. Now, these achievements are significant. I mean, that is a lot of progress that we've seen in the past 4 years. But at the same time that we celebrate this progress, we should also acknowledge that we are only at the beginning stages of implementing the guiding principles. So let me turn now to say a few words about some of the challenges that lie ahead of us. In recent years, we've seen a global crackdown on human rights defenders, especially those who are perceived as interfering in foreign investment and who push the idea that such investment should foster equitable development. ESCRnet, which monitors and responds to harassment of community human rights advocates, has this year alone responded to a 30% increase in cases where human rights defenders have been threatened, harassed, or detained for their work on company impacts. The UN Working Group has communicated directly with a number of companies and states on such cases. At the same time, findings from OHCHR's Accountability and Remedy Project point to increased uncertainty about when and how companies will be held liable for involvement in severe human rights abuses, particularly when companies contribute to abuses committed by other actors. Many of the places where these violations take place do have the legal and institutional frameworks to prevent them, but they're not given the resources or the freedom to carry out their task. Within states, we are seeing some policy incoherence. At the same time that one agency declares the government's support for human rights, another is trading those rights away to attract investments. Many of the treaties that govern these international arrangements offer little human rights protections for workers or communities, while granting extensive rights and complete secrecy to the companies affecting them. And among businesses themselves, while we do see an increased effort to carry out meaningful human rights due diligence, these efforts are still concentrated in a small number of global, reputationally conscious companies, representing just a fraction of the global economic activity. Many of the fastest growing business actors in the world, particularly state-owned enterprises and companies without international reputations to defend, they have not taken up the call to respect human rights. And what's more, they remain outside the scope of our existing leverage mechanisms to make them do so. At the same time, every day we read headline issues like the pay gap between men and women, like tax avoidance, political capture, and corrupt business practices. Although these stories are rarely framed as human rights issues, they demonstrate that the mechanisms and incentives that resulted in Ken Saro-Wiwa's death are still very much with us today. All of these trends illustrate the same point, and the reason the UN Working Group structured this forum around the theme of tracking progress and ensuring coherence. That is, that achievements in commitment and conduct are not enough. If we are to succeed in the task that we came here for, we have to see achievements in results. It's a monumental task. But looking back on the victories of the human rights movement over the last 100 years, so things like workers' rights and universal suffrage and the widening of rights protections for different minority groups, these victories have been slow and they've been incremental, and at times they've been extremely messy. But they have worked because no matter how many missteps or challenges they faced along the way, they always moved in the same direction, towards stronger rights protection for more vulnerable groups in more and more countries. That's what we're working toward as well. So 20 years ago, Ken Saro-Wiwa's death demonstrated the urgency of our issue. 4 years ago, the guiding principles elaborated the structure for us to tackle it. Our task now, not just in the next 2 days, but in the next 2 decades, is to ensure that the growing consensus that we've built remains a sustained and coordinated effort, and that we continue to move towards new structures, new incentives, and new paradigms of doing business. Thank you.